The summons arrived on cheap data film, the kind the Dominion used for contractor payslips and waste disposal schedules. Cale Mercer read it twice, not because the words were complex, because the words were insulting in a way that required a second pass to fully appreciate. He was to report to the Citadel of Aerith. He was to serve as warden of the seventh threshold for the royal wedding of Princess Syleth Vayan to Lord Commander Draven Co. He was to bring his own food, as the kitchens could not guarantee meals compatible with human biology. They had summoned him the way someone summons a portable fence. Cale packed his bag. He packed light because he always packed light, and because he owned almost nothing. 7 years off Earth will do that. 7 years of moving between stations and outposts and warships that smelled like recycled air and alien sweat had stripped his life down to what fit in one bag. Clothes, a med kit, a knife sharpener for a blade he never sharpened because he never used it. The blade sat on his belt anyway. It had sat there for 7 years. He did not think about why. The transport dropped him at the Citadel's lower docks, which told him everything about his status. Upper docks were for delegates, mid docks for merchants, lower docks for cargo, livestock, and apparently human security contractors. He stepped out, and the Citadel hit him like a cathedral made of sound. The walls were alive, not a metaphor. The entire structure was grown from bioluminescent coral that pulsed in slow rhythms, and the pulses carried frequencies that Cale could not hear, but could absolutely feel. His chest hummed, his teeth ached. The building was singing to itself in a language his bones almost understood, and the nearly understanding was worse than total ignorance. Everything was tall. The doorways, the ceilings, the railings that hit him at hip height, because the Veilith averaged 7 feet, and designed their world for bodies that weighed half what his did. Cale moved through the corridor like a man walking through a dollhouse. A very expensive, very alive dollhouse that vibrated. A chair cracked under him within the first hour. He was standing when the court minister found him. The minister was a Veilith named Sorenthi, tall and angular, with the kind of face that looked like it had been folded from expensive paper. Sorenthi looked at Cale the way one looks at a stain that has developed opinions. "You are the human. One of them," Cale said. "You will guard the seventh threshold. It is the eastern passage to the lower gallery. It has not required a warden in 400 years. Sounds important." Sorenthi's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "It is traditional." He left Cale with a ceremonial sash that was 3 feet too long and directions to a room that turned out to be a converted storage closet. The bed was a Veilith resting frame, which meant it was shaped for a body with 2 extra joints and weighed less than Cale's left leg. He sat on the floor instead and ate a ration bar and listened to the building hum. A knock came, small, careful, like the knuckles were afraid of the door. The woman on the other side was Veilith, but shorter than most, with the dark spectrum skin markings that meant servant class. She held a tray of something that looked like glass noodles filled with light. "I am Tuvea," she said. "I have been asked to ensure you do not touch anything important or break anything old." Babysitter. Cultural liaison. That's what I said. Tuvea studied him with open, scientific horror, the way a biologist studies a creature that should not exist at this size, and yet does. She stared at his hands, his jaw, the width of his shoulders in the doorframe. "You are very dense," she said. "I get that a lot. I mean physically, your bones. Our scanners classify your skeletal structure as light construction material." Cale blinked. "My skeleton is rated for building? Small buildings." He laughed. It came out rough and strange, and he realized he had not laughed in some time. Tuvea flinched at the sound, but did not leave, and he respected her for that. She walked him through the basics. Where to stand, where not to stand. What colors meant what which gestures were greetings and which were grave insults. The Veilith communicated as much through the angle of their wrists as through words, and to a human eye, it all looked like the same elegant hand-waving. "And the wedding," Kale said. "Tell me about that." Tuvea's wrist angle changed. She did not explain what it meant. "It is a great honor for the princess," she said in a voice that had been ironed flat. That evening, the welcoming feast filled the great hall with light and sound, and 300 Veilith nobles, dressed in bioluminescent finery that made them look like walking stained glass. Kale was seated behind a column, not near a column, behind it. His chair, a reinforced one this time, someone had learned, faced the stone. He shifted it. He watched. Princess Salith sat at the high table beside Lord Commander Draven. She was tall, even for a Veilith, with bone structure that caught the light like architecture. Draven was broader, military-built, with forearm ridges that looked like they had been sharpened recently and not for ceremony. Salith smiled. She smiled at the toasts and the songs and the gifts presented by minor houses. She smiled when Draven placed his hand on hers. She smiled with her whole face and none of her body. And the smile never once reached the place where real smiles live. Kale knew that smile. He had packed one just like it the day he left Earth. He looked away. The next morning brought the ritual of oaths, a pre-wedding ceremony held in the Court of Echoes. The court gathered. The formalities droned. Then Draven stood, and the room tightened. He invoked the right of contested claim. The words were old, formal, delivered with the calm of a man holding a loaded weapon, and showing everyone the safety was off. Any being who disputed his right to this marriage could challenge him in the Varaketh, to the yield or to the death. It was a power move, a humiliation wrapped in tradition. He was daring anyone to stand, and knowing no one would, because Draven had killed 11 beings in sanctioned combat, and the 12th had never walked again. The court applauded. The princess did not. Kale sat behind his column and watched her hands. They were folded in her lap, still and controlled, and her fingers were pressed together so hard the color had drained from them. He went back to his storage closet and did not sleep. The building hummed. His chest hummed back. Something had started. Kale could not sleep because the Citadel would not let him. The building's night cycle shifted its frequencies to match Veilith's sleep rhythms. A slow, deep pulse meant to pull consciousness down like a warm tide. For Veilith brains, it worked like a lullaby. For Kale's human neurology, it worked like someone running a tuning fork along the inside of his skull. His fillings ached. His vision wobbled at the edges. Sleep was not coming. Sleep had left the building. So he walked. The Citadel at night was a different creature. The coral dimmed to deep blues and violets, and the corridors breathed in slow expansions that moved the walls by fractions of inches. Kale felt the floor shift under his boots, and tried not to think about the fact that he was inside something alive. He found the archive by accident, which is how most important things are found. It was a vast chamber, lined not with shelves, but with crystal lattice structures that held data in molecular patterns. The Veilith did not read books. They read light. Kale touched a lattice node, and information bloomed in the air in front of him. Text and diagrams in flowing Veilith script that he could read, because 7 years of contract work had made him fluent in ways the court would never believe. He read because reading was what he did when the ghosts got loud. He started with history. The founding of the Dominion, 12,000 years of politics compressed into crystal. He moved to law, trade agreements, territorial disputes, marriage codes. He was hiding from the silence inside his own head by filling it with someone else's problems. Then he found it. The right of contested claim. The full legal text, not the ceremonial version Draven had performed. The original was older than the current dynasty by 3,000 years. It had been written when the Dominion contained only 3 species, and the idea of noble blood meant something different than it did now. Kale read the key clause 4 times. The right of contest is granted to any sentient being who holds standing under the Dominion's protection. The challenger need not hold title, land, or lineage. The challenger need only hold the will to stand. Any sentient being, not any Vaelith noble, not any member of the ruling species, any sentient being under the Dominion's protection. Humans had been granted protection status 6 years ago, when their mercenary contracts were formalized. The law had been written millennia before humans existed. It had never been amended, because no one had ever imagined a situation where it would matter. Kale sat in the blue dark of the archive, and felt the crystal hum against his fingertips, and thought about Princess Seelith's hands pressed white in her lap. He did not sleep that night either. Over the next 2 days, he learned the shape of the cage. Tuvea told him some of it, reluctantly, in fragments pulled from her like teeth. The rest he gathered from the way servants moved, from the silences that formed around certain names, from the mathematics of power that looked the same in every civilization he had ever passed through. King Vorath was broke, not personally, dynastically. The Dominion's treasury had been bleeding for decades, mismanaged by a court that treated wealth as scenery rather than structure. Lord Commander Draven Ko's house controlled the military fleet. Without that fleet, the Dominion's outer territories would fragment within a generation. The wedding was not a union, it was a transaction. Seelith was the payment. The currency was her life. She agreed? Kale asked Tuvea. Tuvea's wrist did the thing again, the angle that meant something she would not translate. The princess understands her duty. That's not what I asked. It is the only answer I can give. Kale stopped asking Tuvea. He did not need her to say what her wrists already had. On the 3rd night he went back to the archive, because sleep was still impossible, and the ghosts were still loud. The corridor was empty. The crystal lattice pulsed in its slow rhythm. He was alone. Except he was not. Princess Seelith stood at the far end of the archive, one hand on a lattice node, her face lit by data she was not really reading. She looked like someone who had come to the quietest place in the world and found it still not quiet enough. She saw him. Neither of them moved for a long time. "Why is a human reading Dominion law?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep. The harmonics. The harmonics." She almost smiled. Not the performance smile from the feast, something smaller and more tired and more real. "Neither could I. Not for months." She left. Her footsteps made no sound on the coral floor. Vaelith bodies were built like whispers. Kale stood in the archive for a long time after, his hand on the lattice node that held the right of contested claim, and felt the building breathe around him. The next morning he contacted Mara Voss. Mara had been his sergeant in a previous life, before she got smart and got out and opened a noodle cart on Waystation 12. She was also, in another previous life before that, a military legal officer. She answered his call, with noodle broth on her chin and murder in her eyes, because he had woken her up. He sent her the clause. The silence lasted 11 seconds. He counted. "It's valid," Mara said. "You're sure? It's untested. It's old. It's going to make every Vaelith lawyer in the Dominion choke on their own tongue. But the text is clear, and it was never amended, and under Dominion legal structure, unamended foundational law supersedes all subsequent modification." She paused. "Kale, what are you doing?" "Probably something stupid." "That's not a probably. I've known you for 9 years. That's a definitely." Another pause. "I'm booking transport. I want to watch." She cut the call. Kale sat on the floor of his storage closet and looked at the blade on his belt. It was old, earth-made, decommissioned the same day he was. He had carried it across 7 years and 40 star systems, and he had never once drawn it. He picked it up. It was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with metal. The Court of Oaths was full the next morning. The pre-wedding ceremonies had drawn every noble house, and the air smelled like bioluminescent perfume and political anxiety. Kale stood at the back, in his contractor clothes, with his too long ceremonial sash folded in his pocket, because he had never figured out how to wear it. He walked forward. The crowd did not part for him. He moved through it the way water moves through rock, slow and inevitable, and people stepped aside, not because they respected him, but because his shoulders left them no alternative. He reached the altar stone. Every violet head in the room turned. 300 pairs of luminous eyes locked onto the human who had no business being anywhere near the center of anything. Kale placed his blade on the altar stone. The metal rang against the coral. The sound carried. He spoke in high tongue. The accent they had laughed at. The grammar they had mocked. Every word precise, every syllable earned through 7 years of being the wrong species in the wrong place and learning the language anyway. He spoke the words of contested claim. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a room full of brilliant minds, running the legal math at the same time, and arriving at the same horrible answer. They could not stop him. The law was clear, the law was old, and the law did not care what species held the blade. Kale stood at the altar with empty hands and a full heart, and waited for the world to catch up. The arena was older than the dynasty that used it, grown from the same coral as the citadel, but darker, fed on centuries of blood and adrenaline compounds that had seeped into its structure and turned its bioluminescence from blue to deep, angry red. The Varaketh was not a stadium. It was a scar the Valeth had built a tradition around. Kale stood at the eastern gate and looked at the sand. It was not sand. It was ground coral, pale and fine, and it would absorb what was coming without staining. The Valeth had thought of everything except the possibility that someone like him would ever stand here. 40,000 Valeth filled the tiers above. They were silent, not the respectful silence of anticipation, the confused silence of a species watching something they had no category for. A death worlder in their most sacred ring. Draven Ko entered from the western gate. He was 7 feet of engineered violence, moving with the fluid precision of a species that had turned combat into geometry. His forearm ridges had been ceremonially sharpened, and they caught the red light like blades already wet. He wore no armor, because Valeth fighters did not need armor. Their hollow bones made them fast enough that armor was a confession of weakness. Kale wore no armor because he did not own any that fit. The rules were announced. No weapons beyond the body. No outside interference. Combat until yield, incapacitation, or death. The words were old, and they echoed off the living walls, and the walls pulsed in response, the coral quickening its rhythm like a heartbeat that knew what was coming. Draven moved first. Kale did not see the first strike. He felt it. A line of fire across his left cheek, opened from ear to jaw by a forearm ridge that had passed through the space his face occupied, faster than his nervous system could register. Blood hit the ground. The coral absorbed it. The second strike came before the first had finished hurting. Ribs, right side. The impact folded him sideways, and he felt something crack. Not break, but crack. A warning from bones that were denser than anything in this arena, but not indestructible. 3 seconds. 2 wounds. The crowd made a sound that was not quite a gasp, and not quite a sigh. A settling sound. The sound of 40,000 beings confirming what they already knew. Kale got his feet under him. Draven circled. His movement was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful. all function and no waste. The Kethram martial forms were designed for Valith bodies, for hollow bones and razor joints and fast-twitch muscles that could accelerate a limb from rest to lethal in fractions of a second. Against another Valith, Draven was elite. Against a human, he was something from a nightmare that moved wrong. Kale did not try to match his speed. He could not. No human could. The gap between their reaction times was biological, hardwired, unbridgeable. So he did not try to bridge it. He took the hits. Draven's fourth strike opened his shoulder. His sixth cracked a rib that the second had already warned. His eighth split the skin above his eye, and blood curtained down his face and turned the world red on one side. Each impact was clean, precise, delivered with the efficiency of a species that had perfected the art of taking things apart. Kale stayed standing. This was the part the Valith did not understand. They watched a body absorb damage that would have shattered their own frames. They watched bones that did not break under forces that should have broken them. They watched a creature bleed from 9 different wounds and remain upright, not through will or courage or any quality they had a word for, but through the simple, terrible mathematics of a species built on a heavier world with stronger gravity and thicker everything. Kale was not winning. He was lasting, and lasting was the only strategy he had. Draven struck again, and again, and again, each blow precise, each blow devastating, each blow landing on a body that refused to interpret devastation as a reason to fall. The minutes passed. 5, 8, 12. Draven's rhythm changed. It was small, a fraction of a second's delay between combinations, a slight widening in the arc of his strikes. The Valith in the crowd would not have noticed, because they had never needed to watch for it. But Kale had spent 7 years fighting alongside alien species, and he had learned to read bodies the way some people read weather. Draven was tiring. Valith fast-twitch muscles were miraculous in short bursts, explosive, devastating, built for the killing sprint. But the chemistry that powered them produced waste products that accumulated faster than Valith biology could clear. Their ancestors had been ambush predators. Strike fast, kill quick, rest. Humans were something else. Humans were the thing that followed you. Kale's ancestors had chased prey across open savannas for hours. Not faster, never faster, just longer. They ran and walked and ran and walked, and the animal ahead of them would sprint and rest and sprint and rest, and each rest would be shorter, and each sprint would be slower, until finally the thing just stopped. Not caught, not trapped, exhausted. The prey died standing still because the thing behind it never did. Persistence predation, the oldest human victory condition, the thing no species in the Dominion had ever encountered, because no species in the Dominion had evolved to need it. Kale started walking forward. Not running, walking. Each step deliberate, each step a statement. Blood ran down his face and his arms, and soaked into the coral sand, and he walked through it the way his species had walked through everything, 1 foot in front of the other, across savannas and continents and ice ages and oceans, and finally across the black between stars, not because they were fast, but because they did not stop. Draven's strike slowed, halved, quartered. His breathing changed from controlled rhythm to ragged effort. His forearm ridges, so precise before, now swung in wider arcs that Kale could see coming, could step inside of, could endure. Draven backed up for the first time. The arena went quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with silence, and everything to do with the 40,000 beings in the tiers above, realizing they were watching something they would tell their offspring about. Draven rallied, one final burst. He closed the distance, and took Kale to the ground, and pinned him with a submission hold that was textbook Kethra, a lock on the throat and shoulder that would force any Valith to yield. because their hollow bones would snap under the pressure. Kale's bones were not hollow. Draven leaned close. His breath was ragged, desperate. "Yield, animal," he whispered. "She was never going to be yours." Kale did not roar, did not speak. He stood up, with Draven still on his back, 7 feet of Valeth warrior, clinging to a frame that simply decided to stop being horizontal. Kale planted his human legs on the coral sand and pushed against a gravity that was lighter than the one he was born under, and stood up the way a mountain stands up, which is to say, slowly, and without any interest in what was sitting on top of it. Draven hit the sand. The sound the crowd made was not a cheer. It was older than cheering. It was the sound a species makes when a piece of their understanding of the universe breaks off and falls away, and the new shape underneath is terrifying and undeniable. Draven tried to rise. His muscles failed him. The chemistry was done. He knelt on the coral sand, gasping, and Kale stood over him, swaying, bleeding from wounds he had stopped counting, and the red light of the arena pulsed around them both like a shared heartbeat. "Yield," Kale said. "Not a demand, an offer. The way you offer water to someone who's been running too long." Draven yielded. The crowd erupted, 40,000 voices. The coral walls amplified the sound, and the sound changed as it traveled through living architecture, picking up harmonics, becoming something more than noise. Kale heard none of it. He heard his mother's voice instead. She had sounded like that the day he enlisted. That same roar of too many emotions compressed into a single sound that meant everything and resolved nothing. He stood in the center of the Varaketh, with blood on the sand, and a victory he had not planned, and an emptiness in his chest that winning had never once filled. King Vorath rose from his seat above the arena. The crowd stilled. Everyone waited for the traditional response, the diplomatic workaround, the legal escape hatch that would make this extraordinary thing ordinary again. The king spoke 6 words. The right's victor claims what was contested. Kale had not challenged for the princess. He had challenged the claim itself, and the claim, under the original unamended law, included the right of succession. The arena fell silent. Kale stood bleeding on the sand of a civilization that had never imagined him, and the building hummed a frequency it had never hummed before. The Dominion broke into 3 pieces overnight, and none of them were clean. The first faction wanted Kale dead. These were the noble houses aligned with Draven Co., the military families who had invested decades of political capital in a marriage that a human had unraveled in 20 minutes of bleeding on sacred sand. They did not hold emergency meetings. They held emergency calculations, running the numbers on assassination versus legal challenge versus simply pretending the Varaketh had never happened. The second faction wanted to use Kale. These were the merchant houses and the outer territory governors who had spent years being squeezed between the military bloc and the crown. A human king was absurd. A human king they could influence was youthful. They sent gifts to his storage closet, expensive gifts that did not fit through the door. The third faction believed the law had chosen correctly. This group was terrifyingly small. A handful of minor house representatives, 3 legal scholars who had read the original text and could not argue with its grammar. They believed this not because they loved humans, but because they loved the law, and the law had spoken in a voice too old and too clear to be misheard. Kale sat on the floor of his storage closet, with his cracked ribs wrapped in Valeth medical silk that smelled like copper and light, and he considered the possibility that he had made a terrible mistake. He had not planned this. The succession clause had not been part of his thinking when he placed the blade on the altar. He had been thinking about Selith's hands pressed white in her lap. He had been thinking about cages that look like tradition. He had been thinking about the specific sound a person makes when they say they cannot sleep and mean they cannot breathe. Now he was heir to a 12-species galactic monarchy, and his ribs were broken, and his dinner was a ration bar. Salif came to see him on the second day. She stood in the doorway of his closet, too tall for it, and looked at the man who had accidentally claimed her father's throne. Her face gave nothing away. Velith's court training started at age 4, and whatever she was feeling had been folded so many times it was invisible. "You did not know about the succession clause," she said. "No. You challenged for the marriage. I challenged the claim, the whole thing. I wanted it off the table. And now you are on the table instead. Looks like it." She studied him, not the way Tuvea had, with biological curiosity, but the way someone studies a knot they did not tie and cannot yet read. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to figure out what I've done. Then I'll figure out what to do with it." Most would lie, promise stability, promise they had a plan. I'm a bad liar. It's a species thing. Something moved behind her eyes. Not warmth, recognition. The faintest flicker of a creature seeing another creature choose honesty when dishonesty was safer, and finding the choice interesting enough to stay in the doorway a moment longer. She left without another word. Kale ate his ration bar and listened to the building hum, and wondered when he had become the kind of man who toppled governments by accident. Draven's faction moved fast. Within 3 days, they had invoked the War of Legitimacy, a political trial written into the succession laws that required any contested heir to prove fitness to govern through 3 tests designed by the noble houses. The tests were designed to destroy him. The first test was called the Long Calculation. They placed him in a chamber with a resource allocation problem projected on every wall. The Dominion's agricultural output across 400 years, crop yields, population growth, climate shifts on 12 worlds, trade dependencies, supply chain vulnerabilities. The problem was staggering in scope, and the Velith expected it to break him, because humans lived 80 years and could not, they believed, think past their own deaths. Kale sat with the data for 9 hours. He did not solve it the way a Velith would. Velith planning was architectural. They built systems to outlast centuries because they personally experienced centuries. Their solutions were elegant, self-sustaining, designed for immortal operators. Kale planned for people who would die. He restructured the entire model around generational transfer, knowledge handoffs, training pipelines, institutional memory systems. He planned not for a single brilliant administrator who would live 400 years, but for 20 administrators who would live 80 years each, and hand the work forward like a relay. Each generation would improve what the last had built. Each generation would know things the last had not. It was not better than the Velith approach. It was different. It accounted for a variable the Velith had never needed to consider. Mortality as a feature, not a flaw. The turnover of short lives creating adaptability that long lives could not match. Because long-lived beings grew comfortable, and comfortable beings stopped changing, and the galaxy did not stop changing with them. The judges reviewed his work in silence. One of them set down her data tablet and looked at Kale as if she had just been introduced to a concept she found personally offensive and intellectually undeniable. The second test was the empathy verdict. 2 minor species, the Rethki and the Yolvani, were brought before him with a territorial dispute that had been engineered as a no-win scenario. Support one, alienate the other. Classic political trap. Every answer cost something. Kale did not answer. He asked if he could sit with them. The judges blinked. Velith arbitration happened from above, from thrones and benches and raised platforms. The judge looked down. The judge decided. Kale pulled a chair to the floor level and sat between the 2 delegations and asked questions. For 11 hours, he asked about their children, their harvests, the river that ran between their territories, and what it meant to each of them beyond water rights. He asked about the dead, the ones who had been lost in previous disputes, and he remembered their names the first time he heard them. he found the real grievance under the political one. It was not about territory. It was about a burial ground that both species held sacred for different reasons, and neither had ever told the other why, because no one had ever sat low enough to ask. He proposed a shared guardianship, not elegant, not efficient, the kind of solution a career diplomat would call naive and a grieving parent would call miraculous. The Rethke delegate wept. The Yolvani delegate placed a hand on Kale's shoulder, which in their culture meant something close to kinship. The judges had no procedural framework to reject it. The third test was the body price. Kale stood in the Citadel's core chamber, where the choral's frequencies were strongest, where the living architecture sang at full volume, in the key it was designed for. The key of Valith neurology. For them, it was meditation, deep, restful, sacred. For a human, it was a sustained low-grade seizure. The vibrations entered through his bones and rattled his brain at frequencies his species had never been meant to withstand. His vision blurred at hour 3. His hands shook at hour 7. His nose bled at hour 19, a thin, steady stream that ran down his lip and dripped onto the coral floor. And the coral absorbed it the way it absorbed everything. Hour 22. His vision went, not dark, just gone, replaced by a white haze that pulsed with the building's rhythm. He could feel the sound in the fluid of his eyes. He dropped to his knees. He could hear Tuvea screaming outside the chamber, screaming at the judges, at the court, at anyone who would listen. Her servant-class deference burned away by the sight of a man being destroyed by architecture. Kale completed the cycle. He finished on his knees, deaf in his left ear, blind in both eyes, with blood on his face, and the building singing through his skeleton like he was an instrument it had only just learned to play. When they carried him to the medical ward, his hearing returned in fragments. His vision came back in patches. His left ear never fully recovered. The Citadel had taken a piece of him, and he would carry the absence for the rest of his life. Salith came to the ward on the second night. He was conscious but wrecked, lying on a frame that had been reinforced for his weight, staring at a ceiling he could mostly see. Why? She asked. Not why the test. Why any of it? The rite, the Varaketh, the bleeding, the 11 hours on the floor with 2 species who were not his own, the 26 hours in a room that was never built for him. Kale turned his head. His one good ear faced her. Someone should have done it for you sooner. She stood still for a long time. And then she did something no Valith had done in this story, and very few had done in recorded history. She placed her hand on his. The medical display behind him spiked. Heart rate, adrenaline, cortisol, oxytocin. A cascade of human chemistry that the Valith healers had never seen charted on their instruments, and did not know how to read. They looked at each other, and the building hummed around them, and neither of them said another word, because words were the wrong instrument for what was happening, and they both knew it. 3 days later, King Vorath, the cough that had become architecture in his lungs, finally winning its long war, formally invoked the succession of the proven. He named Kale his heir. Not son, not prince, heir. The distinction sat in the room like a new piece of furniture no one had ordered. 3 days before the coronation, someone tried to kill Kale with a bioreactive toxin dissolved in the coral ventilation system. It was engineered for human metabolism, specific, expensive, the kind of poison that takes research funding and personal hatred in equal measure. It failed because Kale had not been sleeping in his assigned quarters. He had been sleeping in his storage closet, which ran on a separate, older ventilation loop that the would-be assassins had not mapped. 7 years of contract work had taught him many things, chief among them, never sleep where they expect you. 2 more attempts followed, a structural failure in a walkway that activated under his weight specifically, a ceremonial drink at a diplomatic reception that smelled wrong in a way he could not explain, but his gut could. He did not drink it. His gut had kept him alive longer than his brain had. It fit, like it had missed him. On the second day, Mara Voss arrived. She came off the transport at the lower docks, the same cargo and livestock entrance Kale had used, with 3 other human mercs behind her. They were not security. They were not dressed for ceremony. They were the closest thing Kale had to family, which is to say they were people who had survived things together. And that kind of bond does not have a better word. Mara looked at the citadel. She looked at the bioluminescent spires and the coral walls that breathed, and the Valith courtiers moving through corridors designed for creatures made of glass and starlight. Then she looked at Kale, standing in the entrance hall, in ceremonial Valith robes that had been altered 7 times and still did not fit correctly, because his torso was shaped like something the tailor's software kept flagging as an error. "You look like a refrigerator someone put a doily on." It was the first time he had laughed since the storage closet with Tuvea, weeks ago, and the sound bounced off the coral walls, and the walls carried it further than it should have gone, and somewhere in the citadel a Valith servant paused, because the building had just made a noise it had never made. Mara's crew settled in like professionals. They mapped the citadel in hours. They identified the 3 most likely assassination vectors. They positioned themselves at choke points with the quiet competence of people who had been keeping humans alive in alien spaces for longer than anyone had asked them to. Mara herself sat with Kale in his closet and ate ration bars and did not ask him if he was sure about any of this, because she had known him for 9 years and knew that asking Kale if he was sure was like asking gravity if it was committed to the concept. Outside the citadel, the galaxy was reacting. The Galnet feeds ran the story continuously. A human Death Worlder had legally claimed a throne in the oldest monarchy in the Dominion. The details varied by source, but the core image was the same. A bleeding man standing in a red arena, refusing to fall. Human colonies on the fringe, the mining outposts, the terraform crews, the research stations clinging to rocks no other species wanted, erupted. Not in celebration, in something quieter and more dangerous than celebration. Recognition. A phrase appeared on message boards and data networks and scratched into the walls of stations where humans had been tolerated but never welcomed. 4 words that spread faster than any Dominion censorship protocol could contain. Even their laws chose us. It was not triumphalism. It was the exhale of a species that had held its breath for decades, waiting for permission it should never have needed to ask for. The permission to belong somewhere that was not the planet they had been born on and could not return to, and still called home in the private corners of their language where no alien ear could hear. The night before the coronation, Draven Coe came to Kale's quarters. He did not bring a weapon. He did not bring an entourage. He came alone and stood in the doorway of the storage closet and looked at the human who had outlasted him and was about to take the thing his entire lineage had been engineered to control. "Will you be good to them?" Draven asked. He meant the Dominion. He meant the 12 species. He meant Salith, though her name did not leave his mouth, because pride has a weight limit, and he had reached his. Kale considered the question. He could have promised, could have given the reassuring speech that politics demanded, could have offered Draven a role, a title, a reason to stay. "I'll be honest with them," Kale said. "That's more than they've had." Draven left. He did not bow. He did not spit. He walked away with the erect posture of a soldier who has lost a war and chosen to survive it. And there was something in the angle of his spine that looked, if not like respect, then like the space where respect might eventually grow. The coronation morning broke in gold and violet. Delegations from all 12 species filled the citadel. They came in their ceremonial forms, their ritual colors, their species-specific geometries of power and beauty. The chamber was alive with frequencies that Kale could feel braiding through his damaged left ear, like music heard underwater. The ceremony began with the Path of Thresholds. 12 gates, one for each species in the Dominion. Each gate built to the dimensions and biology of its people. The candidate for the throne must walk through every one. It was a symbolic passage, a declaration that the ruler belongs to all 12, not just one. Kale fit through 6 of them. The 7th gate was built for the Rethki, a species that averaged 4 feet in height. Kale ducked. His shoulders caught the frame, and he turned sideways and shuffled through, while the Rethki delegation watched a king reshape himself to fit their door. The 9th gate was built for the Yolvani, whose bodies were broad but low. Kale crouched. His knees hit the coral. The 11th gate was built for the Keth, a species so small they were often mistaken for children by other races. The gate was 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. Kale got on his hands and knees. He crawled through. The king of the Dominion, the human who had bled on their sacred sand, and stood in their killing chamber and solved their problems from the floor, crawled on his hands and knees through a gate that was never designed for him, because that was what passage required. The Keth delegation was silent. Then the eldest among them, a woman whose age was measured in centuries, placed her hand over her hearts and bowed. The image of Kale crawling through the 11th gate spread across the Galnet within minutes. It became the image that defined him. Not the arena, not the blood. A king on his knees, choosing to make himself small enough to enter every door of every people he was about to serve. The 12th gate was his own, human-sized, the only one that fit without adjustment. He walked through it standing straight, and the simplicity of it, the ease after 11 passages of compression and contortion, landed on the crowd like a punchline that was also a thesis statement. He reached the throne. It was ancient, coral-grown, shaped for Valith anatomy, and humming with 11,000 years of accumulated frequency. It faced inward, toward the court, toward the noble houses, and the power structures, and the beautiful, brittle architecture of a civilization that had been talking to itself for millennia. Kale looked at the throne. He looked at the court. He looked at the outer doors, the ones that led to the territory, to the fringe, to the species and colonies and human outposts that had never once seen a king look in their direction. He put his hands on the throne and turned it around. The corals screamed, not in pain, in adjustment. 11,000 years of facing one direction, and the living stone had to reorganize its crystalline structure to accommodate the change. The sound traveled through the citadel's walls, and the walls carried it to the foundations, and the foundations carried it to the ground, and somewhere in the deep architecture of the building, a frequency shifted. The throne faced outward. Kale sat down. The chair groaned under his weight, because it had been built for creatures half his density. The coral flexed, adjusted, began the slow process of reshaping itself around a body it had never expected to hold. He did not make a speech. The throne said it. Salith walked to his side, not behind, not in front. She stood where no consort had stood in 11,000 years of Valith monarchy, at the left hand of the throne, facing the same direction it now faced. And her hand hung at her side, close enough to his, that the space between them was a conversation neither needed to speak aloud. The court watched, the delegations watched, the galaxy watched through every feed and sensor and data stream that could carry the image. In the servants' corridor behind the throne room, Tuvea pressed her hand against the wall. The coral hummed against her palm. The frequency was different, changed. The building was adapting to the man who sat in its oldest chair, and the adaptation was producing a vibration she had never felt. She did not understand the word for it. Her language did not have one. The Valith had never needed a word for this specific feeling, this particular hum, this exact frequency of living stone reshaping itself around something new and heavy and permanent. Humans had a word. They called it hope. The citadel hummed. The throne faced outward. The king sat heavy on a chair that was learning his shape. And across the fringe, on 100 stations and 1,000 rocks, and in every dark corner where humans had made themselves small to fit through doors that were never built for them, the message arrived. Even their